Eh bien, mesdames et messieurs, merci de votre patience. Nous allons maintenant enchaîner avec une troisième conférence de Madame Samaneh Moafi. Je remercie Madame Moafi pour sa présence. Donc, Madame Moafi est architecte et elle vient tout juste d'obtenir son doctorat à l'école d'architecture de Architectural Association of Londres. Donc, je tiens aussi à vous féliciter pour l'obtention de ce doctorat. Et donc, en fait, on va continuer de parler des jardins, mais on va se concentrer plutôt sur le XXe siècle et sur l'époque contemporaine d'Ispahan. Donc, puisque je ne suis pas un très bon orateur, je préfère ne rien dire et laisser la parole à Madame Moafi. Merci.
Merci. Bon après-midi. I wanted to apologize for speaking in English and not being able to present the paper in French. And also, I wanted to say that I'm thrilled to be part of this panel and thank you for staying. Hopefully, it's going to be quite short and not too long. I'm going to talk around a set of 5 gardens, 5 set of different and differing gardens built in Ispahan between 1959 and 1979. And I use the word around strategically. I don't say about, I want to talk around the gardens. I understand the garden in my research not as an archetype per se, but as part of a larger assemblage. And the assemblages I'm going to talk around are housing estates or townships. I will try to unpack the ways in which these examples were made to organize particular models of living, gender roles, and class identities. And in turn, I will try to show what such a project meant for the city of Isfahan and in the context of a global Cold War. I want to begin by this photo. It's from a 1961 report issued by the United States Operation Mission to Iran, a report on the first modern housing estate built in Isfahan. The caption reads, Barotali Esfandiari and his family at the entrance to their previous one-room home open to a small compound shared with other families. On the foreground, we see a man, a woman, 2 boys, and a girl. And we learn the name of the man is Barotali. On the background, we see a door that we learn is relating a room in the back where these individuals are living and a space in the front, which would be a kind of a courtyard. And these 5 people represent the model dwelling unit, a typical dwelling unit that was thought to be worthy of a new modern house. But I want to ask, who were the subjects in this photo really? What were their roles and identities? How did they relate to one another? How was it that they were credited worthy of a new modern house? Barotali, the report explained, was a factory worker among many. By the 60s, Isfahan had become the Manchester of the Middle East. Many incentives were provided by the state for rapid industrialization and the making of new textile factories in the region. And as a result, more and more factories had agglomerated on the southern sides of the Zayanda River. And you can see these factories marked with a square in this aerial survey of Isfahan done in 1959. With the rapid agglomeration of factories, a wave of migration had begun from the peripheries to the city. A wave of unskilled laborers who left their rural homesteads and migrated, sometimes alone and sometimes with their families, for the promise of gaining a job and earning a wage. An encroachment, to use the terminology of the sociologist Asef Bayat. With this process, a change began in the occupancy model of the traditional urban fabric of Isfahan. The majority of the northern sides of the river were composed of courtyard houses, and you see some of these in this aerial image. And each courtyard house had a kind of a nuclear layout. The traditional courtyard house of Ispahan was composed of a series of rooms arranged around a central garden. To go from one room to another, you had to go around this garden. Each room was occupied in a particular time of the day and season, depending on its exposure to sun. The members of the household often related to one another through relations of kin, and the house itself was often passed from generation to generation. With the encroachment of the migrants, however, this occupancy model had started to change. One by one, rooms were rented out, often to those who were of a lower status, to migrants, to the poor, and to the outcasts. Each room was occupied by a group of people. Sometimes they were related to one another, sometimes not. And some stayed for years, and others stayed for only a few days. The social relations and gender roles inside these shared courtyard houses were unprecedented. As described in most novels and films in this period, the yard was a workplace for earning an extra income. For example, the pool was often used for washing the clothes of the neighbors, and the corner of the yard was used for baking bread for the entire neighborhood to earn an extra income. Another character of these forms of occupancy was the inexistence of privacy. In Kimya's film Dears, which you can see a clip of it on the screen now, everybody knew that the protagonist, Sayed, was an addict because the smell of opium would kind of go through the entire house, through the space of the garden. And in Ahmad Mahmoud's novel Neighbors, everybody knew that the protagonist, Karim, had the habit of beating his wife. And everyone also knew that another protagonist, Ashraf, who had the habit of squatting when washing the clothes in the pool, the times that she would be horny, because in those days she wouldn't wear her panties, and everybody would see. And so I'm trying to show you the extent to which there was no sense of privacy. The productive and reproductive labor, first love and betrayal, knowledge and sorcery, all bled and morphed into one another. This bleeding, this inexistence of privacy in itself, provided a sense of spatial unity, a spatial solidarity to the occupants. Even though they were foreign to one another, they felt like they had to kind of look after each other, even in the most minimal kind of a sense. Another something more is that this solidarity was often a homosocial kind. Men stayed most of their time outside the home, working or pretending to be earning an income, unless, of course, if they were addicts or if they were old. And hence, the house was most often the realm of a sisterhood. For example, in Mahmoud's neighborhood, every time that Karim would beat his wife, another woman would kind of come in and intervene and stop the beating. There is one last crucial detail about the working of this new form of occupancy. Given the sense of spatial solidarity and thanks to the closed layout of the courtyard, the occupants were able to maintain a level of autonomy from the state and to operate below its threshold of policing. And what you're looking at here is the last scene of the Dears, Kimya's Dears, and you can see the police is kind of like standing outside the courtyard because there is a rebel hiding inside the room, and the protagonist is going inside to save his friend, the rebel, and then the police start shooting at the house, and the scene kind of like ends with the kind of the explosion of this room. In Kimya's film and Mahmoud's novel, the courtyard was in fact the cornerstone of a struggle against the state. And of course, in the eyes of the state, such cornerstone blocked modernization and change and had to be eradicated. There is no wonder then that Baratali and the likes of him, factory workers, were encouraged to move out of the shared courtyards and into the modern houses. But not all workers could apply. To be eligible, one had to be married to a wife and have more than 2 children. For this, an entire set of new legislations were invented. The worker had to show a birth certificate and a marriage certificate to prove his legitimacy. And where there were no marriage certificates, at the time, many of the marriages were kind of like an arrangement between two people. They weren't necessarily documented. Then the worker had to present his wife as a kind of a proof that we are married. Once proved eligible, the man was entitled to a new home, a private compound, to use the terminology of the report, enclosed by a high perimeter wall. So the layout was quite simple. There was 2 rooms, there was a yard, and then there was this kind of high perimeter wall. When comparing the 2 houses, the new compound and the shared courtyard, 2 things will become clear. Both houses had a nuclear layout, only one was the reverse of the other. If the courtyard of the traditional house acted as a vortex, diminishing the possibility of privacy and organizing a kind of a sisterhood, the yard of the compound acted as a kind of a buffer, separating the units from one another and ensuring privacy between the units and in turn between the women occupying them. The women of the compound were individuals, not members of a sisterhood. In turn, the set of acts and relationships that were organized around the modern yards differed. This is a photo from a report performing what is called a family picnic. The caption reads, Reza Khayyam of the cement factory and his family celebrate their first holiday as homeowners with a family picnic in their own private compound. They're joined for tea and sweets by the Minister of Labor, representative, a workers' representative, United States Operation Missions advisor, and friends. In other words, what we see is that the yard has become a stage for a meeting between 4 men representing the state and the worker's wife. And the worker himself is kind of acting as playing the role of the facilitator. The message was clear. The new yard was no longer autonomous from the state and would never act as a cornerstone for resistance. The other difference between the 2 houses was the relationship between program and space. If in the shared courtyard all rooms were identical, and if the program changed throughout the day, for example, in the morning you would have tea, at noon you would kind of put a sofa and you would all have a meal, and at night you would open up your bed sheets and you would sleep. Things were quite different in the houses of the courtyard. The program was kind of inscribed into the architecture of each room. For example, there was the room that was called a kitchen, had ceramic tiles. One of the rooms was more private than the other. It had less openings, suggesting that that room could be used, was more appropriate for the adults to sleep in, so that they could have their intimacy without the children being exposed to it. And so on. And so again, the programmatic specification of each space, therefore, was encoded into the architecture. The report of the USOM also put a lot of emphasis on the types of furniture that were to be used in the houses and the way they were to be arranged in the houses. This is Khayyam, for example, bringing a storage chest, and this is his wife arranging her boiler, gas stove, and carpet in the living room. And the report kind of makes a note that the family had put shelves on the walls, and this is good that they have kind of like thought about how they're going to arrange their space. This is, of course, no surprise, because in fact, the project that USOM, United States Operation Mission, had done in Ispahan before this project was a home economics project. And I'm not sure how familiar you are with the history of home economics in the United States, but these are excerpts from the book of Christine Friedrich, who is thought to be the mother of home economics. The project was a means for rethinking the house as a factory and reorganizing its labor along the lines of efficiency, a factory with a gendered worker, an operator, to use the terminology of the home economics. And in this particular book that I'm showing images of, Christine is doing a series of experiments on the acts of housework. She says that, you know, if you do it this way, it's going to take this time, and if you do it this way, it's going to be more efficient. And the types of equipment that you're supposed to use, so some of the equipment, she tests them and says, oh, you know, this one is not efficient, and the other one is efficient, and so on and so forth. Precisely for this reason, home economics is also known as a weapon that reorganized the American economy along the consumerist lines. This is a photo from one of the home economics classes in Ispahan. You see the kind of like it has a theatricality to it. You see there is the mirror that is magnifying what is happening on the table. You see the instructor doing a set of acts in a particular sequence, teaching that this is the right way to do things. This is the most efficient way to do things, and the kind of the students around taking notes. The role of the home economics program was quite similar in Iran. It was to reorganize the Iranian society along capitalist line. More and more equipment had to be purchased as more efficient and better kinds were brought into the markets. And this reflected in the diagram of the housing estate of Yusam. The settlement was composed of 5 rows of identical houses, packed tightly near one another. There was a central axis, and there was a water tower. The only program that differed was a series of shops. And these shops had like a kind of a loggia in the front, and they had glass window shops. And the report was quite specific about they had to like install glass window shops. That was important. And this is where the shop sat in relation to the diagram of the settlement. In turn, the settlement was part of a larger assemblage designed and funded. All of them, the assemblage itself was funded by Yusam for remaking the Iranian society along the axioms of class and gender. There was housing, there was a workers' recreation center, and there was a 300-bed hospital. And you see them three on the stage now. So they were kind of like on this map now. So they're kind of very close to one another. The new male worker was to be torn between the factory where he worked, the recreation center where he spent his time on leisure activities, the shop where he spent his earnings, the home where he had to perform as a father and a husband, and on top of these, he had to be checked regularly at the hospital to be made sure that he's not an addict. The new female worker was to become the operator, individualized, removed from her ties of sisterhood, and confined within the walls of her private compound, burdened with the science of efficiency, unpaid housework, and reproduction. The new male and female worker had little time for anything resembling a rebellion. And so what I'm trying to channel now is the work of Silvia Federici and her theory around the battle against the rebel body and its key role in construction of a modern capitalist society. Okay, there is more to this story once we take into consideration that Yusam was acting under President Truman's Point 4 program with the goal of blocking what was termed an infection and the fall of, quote-unquote, the fall of free nations to communism. Let's come back to this image, and let's zoom out a little bit. These are, by the way, from a satellite image taken, they're declassified quite recently. They're taken by a Russian satellite from the city of Ispahan in 1969. Let's stay here. Within a short few years from the Point 4 program's project of housing for Isfahani workers in 1968, one of the acclaimed architectural offices of Soviet Union, Giproger, was commissioned to begin the construction of a new housing settlement, Arya Shahr. Similar to the settlement of Yusam, Arya Shahr was to house industrial workers, but this time the employees of Iran's largest steel mill company to that date, which was kind of positioned here, as you see in the image. And the steel mill company itself was built in collaboration with the Soviets, and they had done the contract a few years earlier. So you see that the company is built, and this is the site that was put for the building of Arya Shahr. And so there was this kind of like natural boundary that was supposed to separate the two sites from one another. Arya Shahr was designed in the shape of a radial grid with wide boulevards. And the area that I'm marking in red is the area that was actually built by the end of the 70s. Public buildings were arranged around the boulevard. And these public buildings were often designed with a monumental shape as symbols and signifiers of the new people who were to live in Arya Shahr. Sports stadiums, municipality buildings, and clubhouses for all kinds of recreational activities. In turn, the building blocks had a nuclear structure. At the center was the public equipment, such as the park and the school. Then you had the low-rises, and then in the periphery, you had the kind of high-rises. So there was a kind of a unity to each one of these blocks. The school was lifted from the ground, and it wasn't gated, so the idea was that outside the school hours, the ground could be occupied by people, by the public. The mid-rises were raised from the ground, so there was this kind of shared walkway that allowed a shared kind of like access to the houses. And the high-rises were lifted from the ground. And this idea of separation from the ground, leaving the ground free, is something that I'm going to come back to in a minute. But right now, I'm going to look at the layout of the apartments. This is the apartment. The towers were in the shape of an L. There was a kind of a wide walkway providing entry to the units. There were two types of units. One of them was a studio that didn't have a kitchen. The other unit was a two-room unit. And it wasn't really necessarily designed for a family per se. It could be two colleagues who were living together or two friends, because there was no hierarchy between the rooms. They were completely identical, and there was a very small kitchen. The idea was that you wouldn't be spending much time in the house. The house was not a place for reproduction, as was the case in Yusam. The dwellers, again, they were not to spend time, they were not thought to be spending much time in the unit. They were thought to be spending much of their time outside and in the public space. The articulation of the ground and landscaping reinforced this. There was a kind of an excess of gardening, landscaping, water features, public seats, steps, and playgrounds and grass, even though the area was quite dry, so they had to put an artificial canal bringing water from the Zayanda River so that they could kind of like maintain the space. Indeed, the social units that were to be organized in Arya Shahr were not nuclear families, and the types of workers that were to be made were not individualized and gendered, as was the case in Yusam. Rather, the workers were to share a common identity and a sense of belonging to a community that was at the scale of the entire building block. Within less than a year from Arya Shahr, a counter-project was launched in Ispahan, this time with the help of World Bank. And this is interesting that the promotional video kind of stops with showing the mountains that were near Arya Shahr. The counter-project was a project for task force family planning, not only for the city, but the entire region. Health centers and mobile clinics were established in each and every village, guarded by an army of health corps workers in their white uniforms and miniskirts. The communication projects, and so the project was communicated by information boards, leaflets, banners in the streets, and they were kind of installed, and I'm going to come back to the mirrors, and TV shows. And these TV shows kind of like, and these were broadcasted and showed to every single home that had a TV, for example. these are the banners in the Chaharbagh street. I'm going to come back to these banners in a second. But so the idea was to teach women and men methods for planning their family and providing them with contraceptives. In effect, however, the project was a means for making every individual to think of himself as a member of a particular type of dwelling unit, as a member of a nuclear family. This is one of the posters, which we also saw in the promotional video. An accurate portrait, I would call, of a nuclear family. You know, you see the woman, you see the man, you see 2 children, but most importantly, you see the representative of the state, policing and monitoring the most intimate conduct of the members. This counter-project was then immediately reinforced by a succeeding project. I was hoping that there would be sound, but there isn't. This is a promotional video named The Grumman Mission, about a commission that the American aviation company Grumman was given for delivering 40 F-14 jets or Tomcats to Iran. And so, the voiceover over this map, I'm sorry, I'm just gonna pretend that I'm the guy. It would say that, you know, Iran is a particular context, you have these countries around it, but most importantly, you have the Persian Gulf in the south, these warm waters the Soviet Union has desired since years back. So the promotional video itself communicates this fear of the occupation of Iran by Soviet Union. Then in this clip, there was only these 2 clips that had voice. In this one, the video is saying that, you know, Iran is a very wealthy country and it has the oil money, but oil money is not enough for modernization. Iran must also invest her human capital. So, so that's interesting. I mean, it's an aviation company. Why would it need the human capital of Iran? What does it have to do anything with F-14 jets? In addition to bringing the Tomcats themselves, Grumman had argued that it had to build an airbase for them in the city of Ispahan. It had to train Iranians about ways of using jets, and at last but not least, it had to build a new housing estate on the northern side of the city. The parallel role of the Tomcats and these housing estates is quite pronounced in the video. In fact, most of the shots were taken from that are taken from the housing estates are from this bird's eye view. So, you know, you have the aviation and you have the Tomcats and you have this idea of looking at this green carpet of lawns punctuated by detached houses. The video is quite explicit about the furnishing, and we see shots of couches being brought in, the dining table, the fridge, the sink, and the oven. The idea was that each and every house would need to be equipped with each and every equipment that a typical American house would have in an American suburbia in the mid-70s. In fact, the settlement was thought to be able to give the land of Iran the coloration of American suburbia. This is the exact wording that I'm taking from the promotional video. And so the kinds of rituals and habits that were organized in the settlement were also American. Take the school, which followed an American curriculum instead of the Iranian one, to the baseball game, it had to be baseball, and to the kind of food that was served, macaroni and cheese. I hope, did it play it or did it not play it? Oh, I'm sorry. So it's kind of like some of the things being moved in. So you see the kind of perfect green in the lawn. No? I'm going to come back to the diagram of the houses. So the layout is, there are 2 units, they're sharing a divider wall, there is green carpets, green kind of like lawn on the ground, and this house is kind of punctuating it. The wall that is around the unit is very, very low. In fact, when I was talking to the people who lived there, they were kind of saying that, oh, like the Americans, they were saying that, oh, it was actually quite low. Like we were kind of a bit, we couldn't quite understand why it's so low. And there was these huge ceilings. So there was this idea that when you're in the living room or you're in the master bedroom, you're constantly watching the lawn. So there was this relation. So you're watching the lawn from within the home, and you're watching the lawn from outside, and you're watching the lawn from the airplane, from the top, right? And so there was a whole set of rituals and habits that were to be organized around the lawn itself. The lawn had to be watered quite regularly. And you have to understand it's a very dry climate. You can see it kind of like at the background of this image, no? And so Carl was telling me that they had to put a water storage specifically for the lawn, because then they could make sure that they're kind of watering it. And it felt like this is their national responsibility to protect the lawn, right? And also this kind of like managing the lawn was something that was mostly done by the women, not men, because men were most of the time at the aviation center, and so it was up to women to kind of like do this. And in fact, I must say that the whole settlement was called khane, which translates to English as a home, and so there was this idea that the responsibility that the woman has to kind of protect the image of the house itself, she had the same kind of responsibility to protect the image of the entire settlement. And there was also these kind of like other kind of acts. There was parties, there was mini golf, there was kind of other things that were organized in this lawn. This is the layout of the settlement. You can see that each one of those kind of like plots of land, they were lawns. You see the curvilinear roads. You see the cul-de-sacs. You see the roundabouts. So like it really looked like an American suburbia. This is where, in the satellite image, the settlement was located. So the whole area in the north of Isfahan was these kind of small plots of seasonal gardens and farms. And so this area that was that is larger, it was owned by one person, and that's why they thought that, okay, they could kind of like purchase the land in one go and reappropriate it for the settlement. What I have been speaking about so far has been the story of the territory of Isfahan being reorganized along the fault lines of the Cold War. An American suburbia in the north and a strong family planning project, a Soviet settlement in the south, and before that, a settlement of private compounds and a home economics project. And this is not only in a conceptual level. I've showed how it was very much the rhetoric of the promotional videos. I want to make it explicit, though, that Iran was never colonized. It was the Iranian state itself that played the two parties against each other, encouraging them to compete with one another by developing the land of Iran, and in this context, Isfahan. And it's kind of like you see that very much in the diaries of the statesman. It is also important to discuss the role of Iranian architects in this context. And for that, I'm going to kind of show this region. I'm going to zoom into this region. The settlement in this region was commissioned in 1978, and it was commissioned to the Iranian architect Nader Ardalan, who I think will be coming here in the next days as well to this conference. Ardalan is known for his work around in the field of architecture, around Sufi traditions. and his theory of a timeless architecture where every element and every form is removed from its contextual specificity and refers to a kind of a higher order. This is one of the models that Ardalan builds for his settlements, and the model itself is quite interesting, no? So he removes whatever is in the context. All he keeps from the city of Isfahan is the axis of Chahar Bagh, the bazaar, and the Grand Mosque. And then he highlights what he calls a spiritual axis from this Grand Mosque to the settlement, and he kind of argues that the settlement is in harmony and aligned with this spiritual axis. This is another model that he builds for the settlement, and so there is kind of like cosmic animism, like to the way that he imagines the settlement, and it's more apparent in the drawings. The city is called the city of illuminations, Nuran, and the way that he puts program to the spaces is quite interesting as well. So the head is a space for thinking, and what he calls the bottom is a space for feeling. So it's very odd terminology when you're talking about an urban space. This is the model and the drawing that he does for kind of like a close-up scale. So you see the house is arranged around this yard, but the yard is quite large when you kind of compare it to the play field. Like there's a quite monumental scale. And so the idea was that by dwelling in these courtyards, you would be kind of in line with this cosmic force, with a higher order, with this spirituality. That would be your dwelling. That's what you're living in. Okay. So Isfahan was not simply a battlefield of a Cold War, but a contested field about what constituted dwelling, living, and everyday life. And this brings me to the last project that I want to show you. The project was posed in relationship to this map. And you kind of like, you can see that this is the, let me bring the laser point. So this is the city of Isfahan. This is the Arya Shah that we discussed before. This is the Soviet kind of like complex. You see, this is the settlement of Khane that I discussed by the Grumman company. And so and the drawing itself is part of an article by Sherban Kantakusino titled "Can Isfahan Survive?" And it's a critique of these kind of urban developments that are happening for the city of Isfahan, and it's kind of like questioning that there is no way that this is sustainable. Like the city is falling apart. There is too much contradiction, and the article is part of this issue of the Architectural Review in 1976, which was a special issue on the city of Isfahan. The project that I want to discuss was posed in response to this problem as a kind of a solution, as a kind of a, this is the way forward. This is how we can get through this. It was titled Rehabilitation in Dardasht, one of the neighborhoods of Isfahan. The project was proposed by Nasrin Faqih, a female Iranian architect who had educated, who was on one hand kind of heavily influenced by Kenneth Frampton and his theories around critical regionalism as a means for resistance. And on another hand, she was very interested in the discourse of second-wave feminism. She was interested in the work of Dennis Scott Brown. She had done a lot of reviews. She published a lot of reviews on her work. And in fact, you see in this image both Dennis Scott Brown and Faqih, the images from the third International Architecture Conference in Iran. Only women were invited to this conference, and the paper that Faqih presents is about a crisis of dwelling as being in the world and in thinking, so in the kind of a Heideggerian sense. The project examined Isfahan in relation to the problem of dwelling. And Farid's approach to scale is quite interesting. So you see the cloth of the Ivan, the shape of the traditional courtyard, and the spatial morphology of the Dardash neighborhood, all in the kind of like the same composition. Scale doesn't seem to refer to the size of elements in relation to one another, but their workings in relation to a problem, the problem of dwelling. The project examines these spaces only to reappropriate them as places for rehabilitation. The project called for breaking away from the usual and day-to-day modern habits, be it Soviet or American, and to kind of return to these spaces and to remember the act of living and dwelling, as if there is like this kind of like the dwelling, the pure dwelling, as if like that kind of a thing exists. And she talks about it as a kind of a resistance, if you like. And then, she publishes, after she publishes the projects in the Architectural Review, a few months after she publishes it in the Art and Architecture journal in Iran. Then a few months or a year actually after, she publishes it in Architecture d'aujourd'hui. And then at the end, she manages to, by 1979, she manages to reserve some parts of the fabric of Ispahan as a kind of a UNESCO heritage protection site. And this was kind of quite new at the time. UNESCO heritage didn't exist before the 70s. Okay. I'm going to conclude now. I have described Ispahan today as a contested field in the context of the Cold War, an archipelago of different and differing and contradicting models of living, gender roles, and class identities, an archipelago of different and differing and contradicting habits and rituals. In the south, a family picnic organized by USAM between gendered laborers and state representatives. In the southwest, a mass gathering in a Soviet public spaces. In the north, mowing a green carpet of American lawns. In the southwest, living in harmony with the cosmic force. And in the center, a kind of a Heideggerian dwelling rehabilitation secured by UNESCO. It is needless to remind you that by the end of this period, in 1979, an entire revolution had swept across the country. And I want to finish by a brief quote by Foucault on, when writing on the Iranian Revolution. The recent events did not signify a shrinking back in the face of modernization by an extremely retrograde elements, but the rejection by a whole culture and a whole people of a modernization that was in itself archaic. I'll finish here.